All right, we're live. Hi, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Continuous Discussions, the online forum where we talk about Agile, DevOps, and continuous delivery. I'm Sam Fell.
And I'm Anders Wahlgren, and today's topic is human factors. And the human factors of my eyes says that I got to read this, with it about this far out. So today's topic, human factors. Human factors impact how dev and ops create and operate software, including maintainability, quality, testing, release processes, usability, security, all of that kind of stuff. People, work, and organization-based factors set the context for human operations, which influences our performance and therefore affects system reliability. So, what is human factors as it relates to human factors and IT safety? What are the key performance influencing factors affecting DevOps? And what patterns can help us to identify and mitigate negative factors? We've got a bunch of questions and a great set of panelists, and hopefully I know we'll have an awesome discussion today.
Wonderful. Thanks, Anders. So let me introduce the panelists. Dominica, welcome back to the program. You're muted, perhaps.
I was. Hi, everyone. I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me. I'm Dominica DeGrandis. I'm Director of Digital Transformation at Tasktop and author of Making Work Visible.
Wonderful. Well, we're pleased to have you. John Allspaw, welcome to the program.
Hi, I'm John Allspaw. I've been in software for a long time, and I've been a student of some of these topics that we're going to talk about.
Wonderful. Well, we're excited to have you here as well. Jay Paul, a familiar face. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? Glad to be
awesome.
back.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. I am currently in the throes of writing my master's thesis on human factors and system safety. This is the program that John went through. So he and I like to jam about that particular topic. And so that's where I've kind of come to this whole topic.
Lovely. Well,
being
we're
deep in that, yeah.
Happy to have you here as a person who's all he thinks about is release engineering all the time. I love that.
Yeah, it's all release engineering.
Yeah, it is all release engineering, like Westworld. All right, Jessica DeVita, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much. Good morning. Nice to be here with all of you. I work on Visual Studio Team Services at Microsoft, and I'm deeply interested in human factors. I've been learning a lot from John and Jay Paul and Dominica over the years, and really, really interested in sharing this knowledge with the world and trying to just help us get better at it.
I love that. And in the spirit of continuous learning and continuous improvement, let's get started with our first topic. So there may be some people out there who don't quite get what we're talking about. And so the first conversation we'll have is, what do we mean by human factors in IT? And we were just having a conversation. It's too bad that it wasn't part of the online podcast, but we were talking all about the above the line and the below the line. John introduced that at DUS 2017. If you haven't seen it, it's freely available for you to go and take a look at. I recommend you go watch it. But let's go ahead and dive into, in a nutshell, what do we mean by human factors in IT? And we'll start with John Allspaw.
Are you sure you don't want to start with the guy who's still doing his thesis and not that's okay. Look, I think that at the highest level, I think what you would say is that the intersection of people, work, and technology, and how those things come together, is about the most accessible description, the most sort of plain language definition of human factors. Now, of course, that's not necessarily accurate. Human factors, it can be described as a community of researchers and practitioners. You could also say that it is a field of study that's been in play and the focus of this community since roughly about World War II. And yeah, I would say that a lot of the topics that we talk about these days in IT, I think it's helpful to acknowledge that human factors is a term that's largely used to describe the sort of the entire umbrella of sub-disciplines, but also sometimes what I might call a splinter disciplines or
radicalized factions.
Radicalized factions, sure. And so yeah, again, it's a little bit like computers. You know, it's like saying that computers was a discipline, and without acknowledging that software engineering and say, you know, perceptual design, like those things are just sort of part and parcel. It's quite weird for folks who aren't familiar with the topic to acknowledge or recognize that ergonomics is a field, and in fact, in the UK and parts of Europe, you would actually hear ergonomics being used more often as the name, whereas in the States you might see ergonomics as really a sub sort of a focus area of human factors. But nevertheless, I would say that the important part is that IT and because of some of the people on this call have now at least been exposed to. I would still say that it's quite early days, and my sincere hope is that that IT and DevOps communities will sort of continue to learn and explore much in the same way as they did, you know, other sort of disciplines like distributed systems and that sort of thing. That's
excellent.
My view.
Excellent, fantastic. So I'm going to move over to Jessica. Jessica, you were mentioning something earlier, and I don't want to pigeonhole you into an answer, but you were talking about some of the things you were thinking about related to AI and robotics in the terms of human factors. I was wondering if you wanted to share a little bit about your thoughts on that.
I do. And I just want to, you know, make a comment, John, to your point. You know, Stephen Shurrock, I hope I'm saying his name correctly, wrote a really nice blog post, like looking back to look forward recently. And in that blog post, he really talks about the nature of the difficulty of describing what human factors is because of the different sources of it and history of it. And he says it's a failure of branding and marketing. We're not marketing professionals and we're not great at it. And so because it's a discipline that has multiple names, it's really difficult for us to sort of not sell it because it's not anything you can buy. But basically, he's basically saying we have to get better at talking about it. We have to get an elevator pitch, and we just have to continue talking about it.
Make it more concrete for people.
Yeah, and that's always a challenge. But I think we're doing great at it, and calls like this are, I think, hugely helpful. So, so some of the more current things that I think are relevant and pertinent to this conversation are, you know, we have seen just in the past 2 weeks, 2 fatalities in autonomous vehicles, and so that's awful. Number one, and you know, people have been hurt and died, and so I think we have to understand that software can hurt people, and it's, I think, an opportunity to, you know, talk about how these things go wrong. And my concern really is that I think a lot more of the people involved at Tesla and these various companies, I really would like to send them a PDF and just, you know, I don't know that they've read some of this research, and I worry about that for us. And basically, and then the other aspect of that is the systems we're designing now are being used to make decisions based on algorithms about someone's guilt or innocence, about whether a child is a there's systems being used with proprietary algorithms to decide if a child should be removed from a home in social work cases. And so we see these applications right now where the algorithm, you can't inspect it. We have I think there's a major safety risk there. And so again, these kind of two areas are interesting to me right now, and I really like to talk to people about it with the impact of human factors and how that might help us.
Yeah, you bring up an excellent point. Not to bite the hands that giving us free Google Hangouts, but when you type in a query into Google and it gives you the authoritative answer, that authoritative answer is based on some algorithm that if they have an agenda, they could definitely insert their opinion into that. Not saying that they're doing that, but they could, right? And it would be very difficult for people to understand it. So that's a very interesting point. Thank you, Jessica.
Or the algorithm might have its own agenda.
Eventually, yeah, exactly, exactly.
You may not know what it is. It may not know what it is. But, yeah.
Right. All right. J. Paul.
So one of my favorite words, and if you hear, all of us at a conference in the hallway track talking about this, you'll hear the word inevitably socio-technical systems. We work in socio-technical systems. And the reason I like that word to describe human factors is it brings the social or socio part, the human part, very front. It's front of the word, right? And so I think, when we talk about human factors in IT, and I really, the slide you had is what has a picture of that ballistic missile alert that I shouldn't be smiling at because it was stressful for a lot of people. But it is a great example of this idea that when we talk about human factors, and I think, Jessica makes a great point about there's, kind of this muddied branding and that sort of thing. And so we need to do a little bit better of that, but it can refer to a number of different things, right? It can refer to the design of how we do our work. John talked in his presentation about how we, his DevOps Enterprise Summit presentation about how we wrestle with these systems. And so it can be that sort of, incident and postmortem and organizational learning that can be a part of it as well. But I think one of the most important things, and I've worked with a lot of organizations and spent, time in this space to just kind of watching the conversations and how we go about wrestling with these systems. One of the things I find most interesting, and we can use, the Hawaii ballistic missile story, or we can use the self-driving car story. There's always a story behind the story. And a lot of times I really think there's the story that gets told, and then there's the story that actually happened. And then there's, just a lot there. And I think human factors, one of the things that it works or tries to do when we discuss it is to acknowledge that. So I'll give you a couple of really interesting examples, right? In the two, when I talk about a story, what do I mean by that? The Hawaii system, the ballistic missile issue that came up, right? They in the reporting that was done around it, one of the interesting things is the person who started the drill, who was a manager, said this is not a drill to the team that was running a drill, right? And that came out later. And I don't think, for all of the incidents, the IT incidents that we run, when things go awry, there's often stories like that where you're like, wait a minute, that makes it a little less clear, was the person quote unquote at fault? And that's actually a whole other thing we could talk about. The other thing I'll bring up, like with the driving car, there's a lot of stuff starting the car in Arizona that killed a pedestrian. There's a lot of interesting stories starting to come out around that, around the investigation. But my roommate is a city planner, and one of the things that was brought up about the story there is the pedestrian was crossing on a paved walkway in the middle of a highway. And one of the designers of the sort of city planning aspect of it was pointing out they actually thought that, and it was signed, "Don't cross here," right? They were looking at, well, the original design may have called for that to be a crosswalk, and people used it as a crosswalk, even though there was a sign that said, "Don't use it," right? And so that is part of this sort of three-dimensional story when we talk about human factors, trying to figure out, obviously there's issues with the vehicle. And another part of that story is they were pushing because the Uber CEO was wanting to do a demo in Phoenix, right? So that's a part of the story about how we make trade-offs. And yeah, exactly. So when you ask sort of what human factors is, it's sort of all of that, and bringing that sort of lens to IT, because, you know, again, hallway track at conferences, we all have a story. That's what makes the hallway tracks great. And it's those meaty, interesting stories, right? And the story behind the story.
And the different perspectives, and Dominica and John and Jessica were talking about that earlier, about how they have the below the line and the above the line, and everything that's below the line is open to whatever your mental model that you project sort of onto it. The way that you think about the system becomes the way the system logically sort of looks to you, which is
right.
Interesting.
The Rashomon effect, if you're a fan of Kurosawa, you know, everybody looks at things differently with their own perspectives and their own lenses.
Their lenses, exactly. Awesome. Dominica.
Paul, I'm so glad you brought up the socio-technical term and aspect, because I think that explaining that term and what that means can help others understand human factors better. And we hear that a lot with sports. And so a sports analogy for that would be, you know, how is technology interacting with human or sports performance? Soccer players now, you know, European soccer athletes will wear these GPS systems and vests, and they monitor heart rate and a whole bunch of other physical aspects to actually measure the performance of the athlete. One of the biggest interests for coaches on soccer teams is injury reduction. How do we make players more safe? And how do we reduce injuries? And so they're using all this technology to help them, you know, reduce the amount of days that athletes are out because they're injured. And I started wondering, well, how do we do that in technology? How do we measure the safety of impacts to people in technology with all, you know, people sitting hunched over their computer all day on a keyboard? Is a whole level of safety issues that we should be concerned about just from poor economics. And in addition to that, what are all the kind of psychological aspects of why people don't feel safe raising their hands, saying, hey, I think this is a bad metric. I think this metric is moving the needle, or we're focusing on the wrong thing here, and that maybe we should look at some other measures to understand the value that we're providing for our organization and how happy people are at their jobs. So I like the social technical aspect of it. I feel like it makes it the human factors conversation a bit more accessible to many more people.
Nice. All right, wonderful. So you touched on this, and I'm going to stick with you, but I'm going to move on to the next topic if Hangout's going to cooperate with me here. So let's talk about system safety and safety culture, right? How do you make it so it's safer for people to operate these things? And we've taken some of the human factors into consideration. So Dominica, I'll start with you.
Yeah. It's a hard one. I think a lot of people don't feel safe speaking their mind in a meeting. You know, we've all been there. You're in a meeting, maybe with 20, 30 people, and or 300 people, and the CEO's just explained the annual goals or the strategy, and then he says, any questions? And nobody raises their hand because nobody feels comfortable raising their hand, or few people feel comfortable raising their hand in front of that many people. And so questions don't get asked, and then leadership thinks everybody's on the same page. Well, there weren't any questions. And then people go back into their own little safe, smaller huddles and ask, what did he mean by that? What are we supposed to do? Right. And so then we have all this, you know, incoherence across many groups in technology because nobody's really 100% clear on what leadership wanted us to do, and they don't want to look stupid, and they don't feel safe raising their hands saying, you know, I don't really get this.
Right. It takes a lot of courage to say, I have no idea. Like, I don't know. That's a powerful statement that allows other people to help you. To be able to do that, I think is super important. Yeah, absolutely. Jessica, what are your thoughts on that? System safety culture?
Oh, I have so many opinions, so many thoughts. So I gave a talk a couple of weeks ago, and I spent a lot of time talking about safety culture and what does that mean. And, you know, I look at, you know, Sidney Decker's book, Field Guide to Human Error, and, you know, he says safety culture, you know, safety is you know, one where the boss is, you know, the boss is allowed to hear bad news. And we see this time and time again, to Domenica's point, is that people in their normal everyday work, you know, make choices and trade-offs that keep the system running, and they're not documented anywhere. They're just their special skill and experience and these really talented humans. But what happens is, if you have a culture that punishes, you know, decisions that were made with, you know, with the benefit of you know, now you're trying to apply hindsight to an incident. Now people notice maybe this meeting, they weren't the cause, or weren't, you know, they weren't one of the humans in the otherwise perfect system. They know that they are not safe to talk. It's because they're seeing other people get blamed, judged, fired, etc. And so I think that this safety culture is one that the boss has got to be able to hear bad news, and people have to feel safe to bring things up. And we see it time and time again, the little things that people do because they care and they come to work to do a good job. But it's only on a Tuesday when some, you know, unique combination of things that happen, or in the case of Hawaii, just for a second to touch back to that, this guy thought it was real, and he did what he was trained to do, and there, you know, something was wrong, but he truly believed that it was not a drill and that this was real. He would not have hurt all of those people. You know, in hindsight, he's like, I feel really bad, you know. And John, we were talking about the second victim when things go wrong. So there's a lot to unpack for safety culture, but I think ultimately it relies on enough people going to work and saying, you know, today I'm going to speak up. Today I'm going to talk about that one release gate that broke 6 things, and they're blaming it on a root cause, but it's really 12 things. And that safety culture is created by individuals in meetings, calls, hangouts. It's how do we help each other understand where we thought the system was going to work one way, and then, boy, it turns out in practice, Joe has this one special script, you know, and Jennifer has, you know, like, she knows the right SQL guy who can do just these right things, and people end up, you know, having these ways of resolving things. So anyway, to close out my thoughts on Hawaii, he thought it was real. A whole bunch of people were really terrified and impacted through that. And it brings up the opportunity to talk about design and, you know, interaction with buttons and what people believe as to why they click on the certain thing, that they, because of their mental model for whatever they're experiencing in that time pressure, they make a decision. Tuesday, it was the right decision, but on Thursday, and now he's blamed and fired and all of that. So there's a lot to unpack with safety culture for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's, you know, as somebody who reads, and I've said this before, so I'm not revealing anything, but I read NTSB accident reports like they were murder mystery novels, you know, and there's generally always a sequence of events, any one of which, if it had been interrupted or not happened, would have, you know, prevented the problem from happening, whatever it was, airplane crash, you know, mistaken alerts sent out, those types of things. And it, you know, you have to be able to, and I think one of the things we're not terribly good at as an industry is kind of that postmortem, that sort of dispassionate, technical cause and effect analysis in a blameless kind of way but yet trying to find those root causes and trying to find, what's the way forward to make sure that doesn't happen again. And
I think
that's something that the airline industry has done, a pretty decent job of, considering, how much I fly and I've never died yet.
I'm going to say one quick comment is, I think you said the word that everybody is like, you said root cause analysis. So
I was like, let's do a shot.
I know.
Yeah.
Let's go there because, yeah. And the other thing, so root cause analysis and trying to get the solution, but counterfactuals, believing that if only we had done X, Y, and Z, then this terrible thing wouldn't have happened. So there's a whole bunch of nuance to those counterfactuals and should have and things like that. But
yeah, I mean, why did that
steamy? I love it. This is awesome.
Why did that airline pilot, push forward on the stick instead of pulling back like he should have? Why did he
should have? Yeah.
Well, should have to prevent the airplane from stalling, according to the laws of physics. What was his mental model at the time, or her mental model at the time?
Why did it make sense for him to do it? That's
Exactly.
what we have to be asking.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely.
What lens was he looking at the situation through that said, here's my mental model shows me that I think that this is going to be the right way to correct the situation. And he just has incomplete information, or they panic and they're put in a position, again, human factors, where they don't have the time or they're stressed or whatever. All these things play into it. You have to sort of make the right decision be like, I don't have to make any decision. It'll just be the right decision. If you can do that.
And the kind of what the aviation industry terms, crew resource management or cockpit resource management, it started out as, I think, it's kind of this notion that, you as the, say, first officer in the airplane have to feel comfortable speaking up to the captain to say, no, I don't think that's the right thing to do. The accident history is littered with times where because that sort of thing didn't happen, the Tenerife accident where the two 747s collided with each other on the airport tarmac was, an example of that, where somebody was trying to tell the captain, no, don't do that. This is going to cause a problem. And sure enough, it did. And so that whole, that whole idea of being able to speak up, to speak, truth to power in that scenario, in the situation where you're the first officer, the other person is the captain in charge, but you
and they should thank you for that. And it's just back to what Domenico was talking about, exactly the same thing.
And
people are afraid to raise their hand.
Yeah, it's a speak up and when you're not comfortable kind of thing, and it's very difficult to do even these days. There are accidents, that involve the notion of somebody knew what was going on and somebody had the right answer, but for whatever reason was not, able or felt comfortable or just couldn't communicate that to the person who then could act on it,
Who it mattered to, right?
who it mattered to at that time. And that's, and I think the airline industry does a pretty good job of that compared to, say, the software industry. We don't have these kind of NTSB-like investigations, except, of course, when we have self-driving cars involved, when the NTSB literally gets involved. But more of that would be better for the industry in some ways.
With an Equifax or with a whatever.
Or with medical devices that deliver 10 times the amount of radiation that it was meant to, or that they wanted to, or all kinds of situations like that, where mechanicals or software or devices kind of don't do what we expect or want them to.
Yeah, because the regardless of what we want, software and little devices are going to become more and more a part of our lives, and so it's going to be very important that we sort of understand what's above and below that line. So, John, actually, you know what, Paul, I'm going to go with you since we're talking about airplanes, and I'm sure you've got some examples.
Well, so that's a very interesting conversation. I did a presentation in 2014 called "Is Your Team Instrument Rated?" and it was trying to look at kind of DevOps through an airplane lens, and there's a lot there. But I was going to, look for, go back for a second to the sort of system safety and safety culture. I think when we talk about safety, that's one of the things that's actually kind of a branding problem to kind of go back to that idea, because a lot of times, you look at the classmates in my class who are also working on their system safety theses, and they're air traffic controllers, they're pilots, they're doctors, right? And then, the IT person comes in and it's like, oh, the website went down and we can't. and then you've got, well, you know, I almost put two 757s nose to nose, right? And so there's those really interesting conversations. But I think one of the things that has sort of come up, I'll tell a couple interesting stories around sort of what, you know, so the question is, what do we mean when we say safety in an IT context, right? And so there are obvious examples of self-driving cars and things like that. But one of the things that I think it's really hard to model, we live in a complex world. We build these complex and operate these complex systems. And a lots of times we don't really know how they integrate into a wider context, right? So the example that I would give is there was a PetNet feeder. It was this pet feeder that you can control online, and you'd fill it with food, and it would like feed your dog or your cat. And there was a AWS like cloud outage, right? And they were starving people's pets now because the feeders just shut down, right? So the thing is that you know, we may say, well, you know, I'm just working on a site, or I'll give you another example, right? Even services that we may think of as sort of not kind of safety critical can sometimes have an interesting safety impact. So there was, I was talking to an engineer at a particular streaming service who shall remain nameless. And they were talking about, you know, if people can't watch TV, well, whatever, right? It's just TV, who cares, right? But it turns out that they had an individual that they were looking at, I guess this individual wrote a blog post, and they reached out to this person because of what they were watching, because they were worried about this person. They were worried that there was like, you know, kind of, and I don't have all the details. I'll have to dig up the blog post. But the interesting point is that sometimes, you know, for even services that we don't think of as safety critical have some aspect of safety to them. And then, of course, there's always, you know, the existential threat. And if you haven't heard of Knight Capital, that's a case, you know, where a company lost $480 million in 45 minutes. And they went out of business the next day, right? So, you know, there are all these sorts of examples. I mean, it's a legitimate question to ask. What do we mean when we say safety in IT? And a lot of times the answers aren't clear. And sometimes that can be a pushback to people, like, why do I have to care about system safety? Right? I'm just doing my PetNet feeder. But there's typically, and again, this goes back to the more complex stories and more rich stories that when you start to dig into a system, there's always some aspect of safety, even if it's existential business sort of safety, right? People like getting paid, and if the company goes out of business, that can be a quote unquote safety.
The human factor, yeah, right there.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I mean, you know, the psychological safety points that Dominica and Jessica brought up, you know, that's another aspect of it. But that, you know, that word is kind of overloaded, so it can mean a lot of different things.
Fantastic. All right. John, what are your thoughts on this? System safety, safety culture.
Couple of things that I have some reactions to as various folks are talking. The first is that certainly there is something about feeling about let's see what Decker might call forward-looking accountability. That is to say, the capacity for an organization to hold those second stories, to hold those individual, detailed, messy experiences with accidents and mistakes up as not only valid but also rich sources of data to protect, to keep confidential should there be some sort of protections with it. This is really a lot that's fueled the blog post I wrote in 2012 on blameless postmortems. Now, having said that, these are necessary conditions, but they are not sufficient. And like I said in the Does talk last year, you can be the absolute poster organization for blameless and still learn nothing. Zero. learning from incidents, and one is really sort of a misnomer, I would say, and I'll get to that in a second, related to safety. But again, it takes a lot more than psychological safety. You can feel absolutely safe and ask all of the wrong questions. Matter of fact, you could ask why maybe 5 times and still not get very much generate many insights from a given incident. So I don't at the same time, I do not want, and again, canonical is Decker, and either of his Just Culture books is there. If you want all of it put together, you could look at Behind Human Error, which you could sort of view as a precursor between Sydney's Field Guide and Just Culture. So that's the first thing. So I don't want to overstate that, but we have to go beyond. Blameless postmortems are table stakes. They are not the thing. They are not the end. They are a means and set conditions. When we say safety, we have to also acknowledge that the world, and not even to say the traditional human factors, because again, I will say the traditional human factors in an ergonomic society is very different than resilience engineering, is very different than cognitive systems engineering, and yet we are sort of muddling a lot of these together. A lot of the folks that we've brought to software do not come from the traditional human factors. They come from cognitive systems engineering. They come from resilience engineering. They come from naturalistic decision making. And so I just want to be sort of clear that these these factions, as we mentioned earlier, exist, but also are the ones that are engaging with this community the most. Second is safety in and of itself is being wrestled with. This is a really problematic word. And if I were to sort of paraphrase Eric Holnagel, he says that safety is, in safety science, is one of the weirdest things about it is that it is defined by the absence of something, right? That there is inherently a measurement problem in the traditional view. And we talked about it earlier about more incidents, numbers of incidents, measurements. But I think, but what's happening in the resilience engineering community, and has been for the 2 or 3 years now, is a full on, I'm going to say perspective shift, because I'll stop short of saying a paradigm shift, but there's a measurement issue. And that measurement issue is that an increase in safety traditionally is represented by a decrease in what is measured, right? How does that work? So therefore, a lower number of reported accidents or unwanted outcomes is seen as representing a higher level of safety. You tell me anything in computing that even remotely resembles that dynamic. It can't. And so therefore, instead of looking at these, and here's where I will sort of call this shallow data, what we've unfortunately begged, borrowed, stolen from, I would say, manufacturing, is the number of incidents, days since, right? Bullshit. It's absolute horseshit. It means absolutely nothing. Lost time, lost time injuries. It doesn't. Because what you haven't told me is what did work. For those of us who are working that has a service that is generating revenue, there are close to an infinite number of things that kept your service from going down today. But we don't count the days that things are. We don't explore how things are kept up. Right,
John, I was just going to say, you always like to say, we never postmortem why the site is up.
Exactly. Right. And so, but that is actually what we do. And the reason why we don't do this is because because of habituation. We do not look at things that we don't think warrant attention.
Right.
And so that if I catch myself running a command, here's one. if I'm looking through a run book or some sort of procedure on a wiki, and I'm doing that thing that run book was written for, and I've been around for a while, and I know the ins and outs of these systems, and I know that if I go through with step number 5, there's probably about an 80% chance that it's not going to end well. And the reason why I know that is because I have experience. It's not codified inside the procedure. Why? Because the person who wrote the procedure, just like people who write alerts, imagined a world that didn't encapsulate or include the context that I'm using it in. Mm-hmm. So on the one hand, I am straying from procedure, right? And you're damn right, and you hope that I stray from procedure, because if I follow the procedure just exactly as it says, things might not go well. The Knight Capital event I have presented to multiple audiences multiple times, given not the name of it, but the high level circumstances, and I do not know anybody, any organization that would not have done exactly what they did. They would have done exactly. And in fact, the reason why they do that is because they have done exactly what they did. And almost every time it fixes the issue. Mm. And so that's the part about safety. Safety is, Paul is exactly right. It is an absolutely loaded word. We cannot say the word safety and expect that, especially in IT, and expect that the person who we're talking to understands what we're saying, no more than we could say DevOps, no more than we could say Agile. The last thing that I wanted to say there is just a comment on aviation. I now know and hang out with enough people here. There's my good friend Richard has taught me this quote, and I do not remember the source of this quote, but the quote goes like this: "Distance lends enchantment." And I would like to think that the corollary is that, and familiarity breeds contempt. I would say that
might be where you were going.
I'll say that the NTSB and the current state of aviation accident investigation is absolutely not what we should be emulating whatsoever. There is a great deal, and the thing that they have is a lot more history than we have. The thing that they have is also a lot more wrestling with standards of good practice, and they've had many decades. That industry has many decades, and I don't know anybody who is on the forefront thinking, forward looking. Certainly nobody in the resilience engineering community that would say that that aviation as a whole, there are some countries and jurisdictions that do this much better than others, but the new view of human error and systemic view is it's actually not. I think actually we can do much better because we are not actually tethered at the moment by regulations that can ground a pilot for entering a cockpit with coffee that's too hot with no lid on it. That's the world we live in right now. That is literally the world we live in. And so no, actually I won't concede. I'm going to say that, the accident models, I would argue, are still quite antiquated. The reason Swiss cheese model, the idea that sequence of events, which are still linear, that really don't take into account systems, even just sort of rote systems thinking concepts. There's a ways to go. So I'd say that my friend Brian Moon works down in Alabama, and he's in Birmingham, and he used to work at, or maybe still does work at a company called Deal News. And so there's this website, consumer-facing website, and quite often what would happen, because there are a lot of defense contractors in town, they might leave defense contracting and then come work at Deal News. And so somebody would jokingly say, well, listen, how can we figure this bug out? It's not like this is like, it's not like this is rocket science. And the guy in the back is like, so actually I'm a rocket scientist and and then those people say, well, listen, it's not like this is brain surgery. And Brian says like, well, just waiting for a brain surgeon to show up and say like, well, actually brain surgery is probably a lot easier than this. But.
So John, you mentioned, so you'd say no NTSB model. They have lots of history, but they're constrained. It's more brittle, I guess, is what you're saying.
I would say there's many reasons. I would say that the NTSB has also evolved. It's not like the NTSB was formed and then they've been doing accident investigation the same ever since. Right? That has also gone through sort of multiple paradigm shifts over time. I would say that we certainly need to make ourselves aware, available. We need to be curious, but there's no accident investigation board or body currently that does this stuff. That does this stuff is in a way that we should wholesale model. I just don't. It's just not a thing.
So part of me says there you're kind of throwing the perfect, in front of the good, in some sense, right? I mean, I think it's hard to make a concrete argument that they haven't improved the safety of the industry.
Oh, I didn't say that.
Yeah.
No, I know, under no circumstances. But I would, yeah, no. But here's something. Here's something that the NTSB does that we won't, and we likely will not. Some of us are in California right now, right? Some of us are in New York. In both of those states are at-will employment, which means that I don't care whether or not it's you keep your postmortem data in a wiki or whatever. They are all subject to discovery. If a stockholder or a shareholder wants to sue based on an outage or an accident, there's nothing that protects that. There is no public, by law, there are no public debriefing notes, interview notes that the NTSB needs to give up to any legal entity.
And in fact, they got angry at, I think it was Tesla or Uber, for sharing details about this latest crash before they had sort of notified the NTSB.
And when you put somebody from the NTSB, you put an investigator from NTSB on a stand, they will bring a copy of the written report, the final written report, and all of their questions will be answered by reading that report. Nothing else. We do not have that. We do not have privilege. It's called legal. The legal term would be privilege. The U.S. military and the DoD does. But it helps.
And so, but to move beyond that, so you're saying that that's not the right way. So is it just to create resilient systems? Is it just like, how do you?
No. It's not a I wouldn't put the word just in front. Just simply
Come on.
Sprinkle some resilience on it.
Yeah, exactly. No. That's not a thing. That's what you just described was not a thing. I would just say that we just have to acknowledge that it's going to be like, what should we do? Well, we should look into that and not expect that we'd be able to cover it on a 1-hour podcast. I think that there is no pithy answer, just like there's no pithy answer to what is DevOps or what is, I think that we have some advantages. We have advantages in that right now we are not heavily regulated, right? If we were heavily regulated like aviation, then you'd go to jail if your seat height wasn't tall enough compared to your desk, for example. That's what we would have. So we need to look, how do we actually how do we actually create safety? What went into making our services work today? That's a very, very different thing. And by the way, our services work almost all the time. And so this concept between safety 1 and safety 2, and if you want to get a good high level, you could look at Jessica's talk that she gave at Codebeam a couple of weeks ago. The idea of safety 2 is by looking at things that go well in order to amplify, repeat, and generate insights from that. The view of safety one is look at all the things that we did, look at all the failures, learn what you can from there and extract from that. Well, shit, I mean, that's not a lot of data because our servers are up way more often. And in fact, people protect the service from going down actively. In the DOES conference, I asked, you know, if you were to not touch your systems at all, nothing, do not respond to a page, do not do anything, hands off keyboard, how long do you think it would stay up? And would you be able to hazard a guess on how it would go down when it did? So, I mean, the fact of the matter is that in the end, people create safety. Safety is the presence of adjustments, some of them small, some of them deemed to be minor, but absolutely critical. Does that make sense? It's a paradigm. My suggestion is to read Safety 1 and Safety 2. An even easier tease on this particular topic is to see what Steve Shorrock has written at Eurocontrol. His work at Eurocontrol. Now, if you wanted to say that what the attempt that he's made at Eurocontrol is actually quite impressive, and while nothing's perfect, is a good example of what sort of this forward thinking might be.
Awesome. Paul, you had a comment you wanted to chime in with?
Well, I just wanted to mention, I mean, one of the interesting things to remember about the NTSB and aviation is at the end of the day, they use those reports so that insurance companies that insure, you know, Boeing and the FAA can figure out in court who has to pay. And that's one of the things that we are specifically trying not to do, or at least, you know, that becomes problematic. The other thing I'd point out is I was just at SRECon and there was a presentation on how the chemical industry does this. And I've seen it, you know, kind of examples from nuclear. And so I think one of and I don't want to put words in your mouth, John, but I think one of the things that it's important to not do, and that's, I think, where the caution is to just cargo cult. If we were just like aviation and do what they did, it would work in IT. Or if we just did what nuclear did or what chemical plants do, it'd just be fine. Yeah. There's a big contextual shift in the contexts, and that's something you can't just sprinkle, right? And that's the hard part of it, right? Is that you have to do that. So I think, you know, that's just the point about, you know, the NTSB does a lot of really great things and they do a lot of not as great things. And we want to be careful about copying them. And then very quickly, the other thing I wanted to point out, I've noticed this pattern with IT a lot, people in IT, and it's a fascinating one to me. I think you ask anyone, does the system you work in, is it complex? Is there a lot going on? And people say, yeah. They get that. I work in a complex system. And then they will say, well, we're going to find the best practice to root cause the outage of our complex system, right? And they won't let go of like root cause and best practices. And in complex systems, those aren't things. Yeah. They are not things. Yeah. And so what's interesting to me, though, is how many really, 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 really smart people acknowledge they work in a complex system. And then they use that language, which is a very, safety one, linear kind of modeling of the problem. So I kind of have a new thing where I just at conferences, will notice when people say we root caused our complex system. It's like, okay, tell me more. Yeah, we have such complex systems, and in order to understand what's happening, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the length of time in our outages in minutes, and I'm going to average them. that'll give us a complete picture of our complex system.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. I mean, I just want to be careful too, though, because yes, complex systems, but that doesn't mean that phenomena are not observable and explainable and preventable and learnable and teachable and all of those kinds of things.
It actually does. It actually does mean that those things are not possible, because complex requires complex, unless you want to use just a fancier word for complicated, emergent phenomena are not things that can be
There's some-
anticipated.
When
There
I tell people in my workshops, because they'll talk about best practices all the time, and I'll say you cannot have a best practice in an unordered system if you don't know causality, if you don't know cause and effect, then you cannot have a best practice. And that, I think, seems to help some people get it, that depending on the context of the situation, you may have several good practices depending on which expert you ask. But in an unordered system, in a complex system, then you don't have that, because depending on the bias that people bring to the table from where they've been and what their experiences have, if they've been in a bureaucratic system for a long time and they think everything has to have a best practice or everything has to have a run book, then that's where they can get into trouble.
I think, Anders, what you're talking about is something we call retrospective coherence. So in other words, in retrospect, we coherently understand what the system was like. And there's a great example. If you had an infinite amount of time, let's say you have an outage, and then you have an infinite amount of time to research that outage, and you found out every story, you talked to everyone, and you talked to their friends and what kind of day they were having, and you just get really, really deep into the cause of that outage. Well, first of all, we don't have infinite time, but if we did, even if we were able to make sense of that in a complex system, a microsecond later, all of that data that we had, it doesn't actually apply it anymore, right?
It's sort of like the butterfly making the
quantum
hurricane.
theory. I'm not sure I buy into the quantum theory of safety.
Well, yeah. So I mean, but so the point is that we don't do that, right? We don't take infinite time to research these things. In fact, they're typically time bound. Some might argue on purpose, right? And that's what makes that really hard. And this goes back to the thing that makes this entire topic hard, is that we're talking about sort of when we get better at it, there's an absence of something, right? Which is not typically a model that humans are good at, like, sort of reasoning about, because it's not super intuitive.
Yeah. All right. So we have pretty much exhausted all of our time. We do have one topic left. We can talk about good examples of bad examples, or we can talk about making lemonade. We've sort of already talked about both of those already. But if anybody has anything else they wanted to add on either of those two topics, we've got a couple more minutes left. We haven't heard much from Jessica, if she would like to comment. I don't want to put her on the spot.
Oh, no, it's fine. No, I was really enjoying this discussion and this, for me, when I think about talking with people about human factors and what does it mean and why I care about it, a lot of times the question comes, all right, great, what next? What do I do Monday? What do I do when I go back to work? And for me, your mileage may vary, but I really like to start listening for a couple of words, which help me understand where other people are in terms of, are we speaking the same language around what does it mean when I say safety, or what does it mean when you say it? But to touch back to Paul's point and the root cause analysis, for me, whenever I hear words like best practice, that's like, oh, that tells me that this person understands this. This is an ordered system where they understand it. They've seen it before. So it's like, oh, it's some pattern matching. Oh, this is what this is. And so here's your best practice, and that's all they see sometimes. But as you move through that Cynefin model, you can get to this understanding of you're in the complex quadrant, which all your best practices don't necessarily help you, because it's things you haven't seen before. They're things you haven't protected yourself against. They're systems that you've only architected to the extent of your knowledge about what is going to keep the system up. So I like to just be listening out for a couple of words. That's been helpful for me. If I'm hearing best practice, I just gotta pay attention to what they're really saying, and not correct them, but just have it's an opportunity to have a deeper dialogue about what they mean when they say that. And then the other thing is, everybody, this is nothing we all haven't said 100 times. There isn't such a thing as root cause. And if that word bothers you as much as it does us that are learning about this, don't try to change it overnight, but take a look at adding things like, contributing causes or multiple root causes. Like, you can take that word because people are expecting to see it, but you can start to add this other language that acknowledges, all the things that you have discovered about, a failure or an incident. So those are my two things I'd wanted to just point out or just ask folks about, like, hey, what do these words seem to be something you should pay a little closer attention to as you start to learn about this.
I have one last point, if there's any time. I don't
Absolutely.
know, but John talked about kind of shallow metrics, and I think that's key for us to look at. It seems that many shallow metrics are simply descriptive metrics. They're simply a count of how many times something happened, like the number of deployments a day. Hopefully you're going to measure something because it's going to give you information to make a business decision off of. But how does the number of deployments a day help the organization make financial or investment decisions? Maybe it does, but does it really? And so what we're measuring impacts workers tremendously, because people value what is measured and they will march down that path. And because the name of this term, human factors, has the word human in it, I'm curious how much Maslow's hierarchy comes into this, because everybody just wants to be part of the tribe. We do things we think provide value to others, and others do things that they think provide the value to us. And so many times we don't give people what they want, and other people don't give us what we want. And I wonder how much that plays into all of this in human factors.
Well spoken, nicely said. I think that's a perfect opportunity for us to say thank you. I have learned a ton about this. I appreciate you letting me be part of this tribe of people who know a lot more about this than I do. So I'm happy to be wrong, and we can go back. I'll look at the root cause of why I didn't say the right thing. I'm gonna figure it out.
We're gonna do a blameless postmortem. It's fine.
I'll figure it out. But I really appreciate everybody joining. Thank you so much for the conversation, and we'll see everybody on the next episode of Continuous Discussions. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Thanks very much. Very much.
Thanks so much.